Well, hello and welcome to a special episode of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint podcast. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I am also the host for the podcast, so I get to wear a lot of hats. And we are here today for a special episode. Of course, you know that we do episodes every 2 weeks, and occasionally something happens that's kind of special or kind of exciting, and we decide to create another episode. And that's exactly what we've done here. There's a new book that we're going to be talking about. In fact, this book just showed up yesterday in my on my front porch, and we're going to be talking about this book called No Restraint, written by Dr. Charles Bell, who I'll be introducing here in just a moment. But those of you that may not be familiar with who we are and what we do, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was formed in 2019. We started out really focused on the issue of restraint and seclusion, heavily focused on things that were happening in schools. But it's broader than just restraint and seclusion. It's restraint, it's seclusion, yes, but it's also suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, often all the things that are done to kids in the name of behavior. And we are here to promote changes in laws and policies. We're here to promote kind of an education around how do we do better? How do we move away from these restrictive practices? How do we move away from punitive and exclusionary discipline? We, of course, advocate for what we call the 5 principles, which are approaches that are trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, neurodiversity-affirming, relationship-driven, and collaborative. We believe we can do better, not only for the kids and the students that we serve in many of these situations, but also for teachers and staff and for others. So excited to have you here today. Again, this is a special episode, so a little different from our normal episodes. I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. We're going to bring Dr. Bell up on the stage here. And hey there, Dr. Bell. I'm going to actually read your intro here so people can know who you are. Before I do that, though, I'm just going to say, if you are watching live, and I see already that I can see a number of people that are on live, if you are watching live, let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from and maybe why you're here today. It's always fun because I know, Dr. Bell, we work across the United States here, but we also have a lot of people that join us from all over the world. It's not unusual to get people from, not only Canada, but the UK, Australia, New Zealand, India, just kind of all over the world. So it's always fun to see where people are joining us from. And with that, let me go ahead and I'm going to read through your introduction here. Dr. Charles Bell is an award-winning associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice Sciences at Illinois State University. His research explores how out-of-school suspensions, seclusion, and restraint impact families and teachers throughout the U.S. The Society for the Study of Social Problems selected Dr. Bell's book, Suspended, Punishment, Violence, and the Failure of School Safety, as a finalist for the Wright Mills Book Award. Additionally, he has worked on as a subject matter expert on school punishment, violence, and public health projects with the Center for Disease Control and the National Center for School Safety. His scholarship has been featured on NBC News, NPR, Detroit News, PBS, and several international media outlets. Dr. Bell has served as an expert witness in state and federal school punishment cases, and of course, just had a brand new book come out. And I don't know if yesterday was the official day, but as I mentioned to you, I just received my print copy here in the mail yesterday. Unfortunately, because I've been lucky enough to be connected with you for some time now, you gave me the honor and privilege of getting to read an advance copy. So I was able to read this before it actually got here and delivered, which was really exciting. But Dr. Bell, I'm really excited to have you here. And in addition to all the great credentials that I just read about you, I feel like you're just a friend and colleague in this work, and I'm happy to have you here and joining us today. So welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to have you. And I think we were both discussing, and I'll just let our audience know, we were both discussing getting over having colds. So, if at any point, I begin coughing or you begin coughing, audience, please forgive us. Apparently it's going around. I've talked to people in several states today who tell me, oh yeah, it's going around here too. So we'll have a good conversation despite all of that. So, you've been doing work, for quite some time that's actually highly aligned with the mission that we have. So, we do a tremendous amount of our work around kind of punitive exclusionary discipline. And, of course, restraint and seclusion are really where we started. But even more broadly, it's the suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all these things that are often done to kids. And we actually happen to know that certain kids are more likely to end up on the other side of these things Tell me, how did you first kind of end up moving in this direction in terms of the work that you're doing? How did you become interested? I know you previously wrote another book that I think I have over there on my bookshelf. But how did you initially kind of get into this work, and then what brought you to the issue of restraint and seclusion?
Certainly. So I think that your first question, how did I get involved in this work? I was really interested in understanding why a lot of my peers were missing from higher education. I graduated from Detroit Public Schools. I'm from Detroit, and predominantly African American city. And the further along I went in higher education, the less African American students I saw. And I wondered why. What was holding students back? So I started looking at the literature, looking for research to support this. And I stumbled upon a term about 20 years ago, the school to prison pipeline. And it's like a light bulb just went off in my head. Aha. Because I could see literally the school to prison pipeline and how it operated in my community. It brought back memories of kids who I went to school with who got suspended and never came back to school, were completely detached from the academic environment. And then I had to reflect on my own experiences in K through 12. I'd been suspended before. And although I was able to overcome the impact of most of the suspensions, I understood that if I didn't have the support, then that could have been myself as well. So it was immediately, I knew there was a problem. And then I realized that the literature at the time was very heavily quantitative, and very few scholars had ever asked the community, how does this suspension impact you? How is it impacting your family, your parents? So I figured that this is something that I could do because I'm right here in Detroit, and it was almost as if the entire Michigan or the entire state of Michigan had been skipped in the research literature. And I just knew there was something unique here with the housing crisis brewing at the time and the eventual bankruptcy of Detroit and the Detroit public school system. I just knew that there was something here that I could make an impact on immediately. And as I began doing the interviews, it was really just stunning to see the connection between how school suspensions had operated 20 years prior when I was a kid, and still manufacturing as a machine, grinding kids up and spitting them right into this prison industrial complex. And moving into the seclusion and restraint issue, I remember just publishing my first book and taking a step back and looking at my data. And then I noticed something that initially I had kind of taken for granted. I started noticing that students with disabilities had longer suspensions, were more likely to not receive their makeup work, and teachers were more likely to refuse to give it to students with disabilities. And then I realized that, is there a specific phenomenon where students with disabilities are experiencing a unique set of punishment in public schools? And I remember looking online and then coming across the seclusion and restraint, and in particular, the Quiet Rooms article written by Jody
Mhm.
Cohen.
Yeah, yeah.
And that really ignited my interest in this because I was looking at the research literature, and I know I'd been following many school punishment researchers for years, and no one had mentioned seclusion and restraint. All the research was on out of school suspension. All the public engagement was on out of school suspension. So I just figured this is an understudied social problem that we need to study. And the deeper I went into it, the more shocking and the more horrifying it
Mm,
became.
mm,
So I
mm.
knew that this was something substantial, significant, that I needed to do, and a book needed to
Yeah.
be written about this.
Yeah, yeah, no, I hear you. And of course, the book is now out, and it's called No Restraint: Disabled Children and Institutionalized Violence in America's Schools. This just came out, and it tackles a really tough issue. You and I were talking before we went live here, and you were sharing. I just want people to understand, like, some of this is hard to hear, and it really can be triggering. Unfortunately, I'm here and doing what I'm doing with the Alliance because I had a personal journey, because I had a son who experienced this, and I would not even have imagined that restraint and seclusion was something that even would have been possible to happen to him in school. So, I do want to remind folks as we talk about this. I mean, some of this really is tough to talk about. Some of it is, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many times you hear it. I mean, there was I don't know if you saw this, Dr. Bell, but the new Department of Justice investigation just announced yesterday in Missouri, St. Louis Special School District. And I mean, it's just horrific when you begin to read, look at the data, understand the impact. So again, we want to remind folks that this is a tough conversation, but we're glad you're here. And again, if you're watching live, please let us know in the chat who you are and where you're from. Jocelyn here from North Carolina said, Dr. Bell is so knowledgeable. The world should listen. I agree with that. So we're off to a good start with that. You've got a lot to share. So I want to dive into the book, if you don't mind, and talk a little bit about, kind of what the process was behind this and kind of what you found. Of course, we're going to encourage people to get their own copy of the book. And I know we've got a special discount code as well that people can use to get, I think, 30% off. Look at that, right on cue. There's Courtney. So be sure to check that out. We've got a link there. We'll try to throw that in the chat as well, so you can click on it. And a couple more people have said hello. We've got Stacy here. So glad I made it. We're glad you're here. And we've got Sarah Ann here from Nova Scotia, and great to have you here as well. So let's talk a little bit, and you began to give us a little bit of background on what led you to this. And it's interesting, because you were really framing this in that conversation around school discipline. And in theory, and this is where theory, separates from fact. But in theory, restraint and seclusion are intended as crisis management interventions, not intended to be discipline. However, in practice, very often what we see, in fact, is that they are used for compliance, they're used for control, they're used as a form of discipline, and they're used in many ways that they're not intended. So you begin this book, and your first chapter here, first you have an introduction talking about seeing seclusion rooms, but you talk about the violence of restraint and seclusion. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, what you mean by the violence of restraint and seclusion?
Certainly. So when I began this project, it initially started in Michigan and Illinois. That's where my school punishment research had started, so I figured I would start there. And overnight, the recruitment flyers online, I'm getting calls from around the country.
Well, we were sharing those,
Exactly. What about Maryland? What about North Carolina? What about what's going on in Texas? Can we participate? I didn't know that this situation was so severe, that this was happening everywhere. I'm a school suspension scholar, so I'm going into restraint and seclusion. And I'm thinking that, as you said, that this is used in emergency situations. And I'm learning on the fly that this is not emergency situations. So getting towards the violence of seclusion and restraint, I had a parent send me a photo of a seclusion room where their child was in. And there was blood on the wall.
Yeah.
There's blood on the floor. And as a criminologist, I show a documentary on solitary confinement every semester in my introduction to criminology class, or whenever I teach this course. So that documentary it's burned in my head. It's burned in my students' heads. They never forget that film. And looking at the photos, it literally brought me right back to that film. And I'm thinking, I'm analyzing the photos as this parent sent them to me. And I'm looking at, there's no padding on the walls. Where's the padding? Why is there a middle door that should not be there? This room is completely unfit for any crisis intervention. And then the parent told me that not only was her kid placed in this room, but school staff watched as this child harmed themselves and did not intervene, did not offer any assistance. And school staff actually sent the photos.
Wow.
I could not believe. It was just unbelievable at the time. I was just so in shock that this could happen in not only in the United States, but of course to a child.
Right.
Because when we talk about solitary confinement, we're talking about adult inmate offenders. And there's even disagreement about the utility of solitary confinement amongst adults.
Right.
In juvenile
it seems to be a lot of research around the harm that it can cause in adults. And we've seen cases where there've been, there's been, adult facilities that have prohibited the use of these things, yet that we allow them to happen in schools to, a 6-year-old Black autistic child, right? I mean, if you look at the data, we know there's certain kids that are far more likely to be restrained and secluded, and it's children with disabilities, Black and brown kids that already have a trauma history. very young kids. I mean, that's this really surprising part about the data often is that, people assume you're talking about a crisis. You must be talking about a 16-year-old that's dysregulated, but you're talking about a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old in so many of these
Exactly.
cases.
The kids playing with Pokemon cards.
Right.
It was just, I was just completely mind blown at the
Mm,
gravity of the situation. And then the violence. So you have the overt violence that you're seeing there, but then the intent to cover it up.
mm.
The I think it's one thing when you encounter a school staff member who makes a mistake, does something, there's an apology, there is a systematic awareness, retraining, and I never saw that in the book. There was no admission of wrongdoing ever. There was a cover up every single time, and it was almost as if schools were aware that there's mandatory reporting associated with seclusion, restraint, physical restraint, mechanical restraint. So we know we have to call parents and tell the government if we use these terms. So we're going to use calm down room. We're going to use quiet
Right.
room
Right.
to intentionally mislead parents and mislead the government.
Right.
That's violence.
Right. Well, you know what's interesting is that you know I often hear the word violence in the discussion about restraint and seclusion, but they're usually talking about the children. And I have to be honest with you. When I hear the word violence in the context of a dysregulated child who's having a hard time, I get really concerned about it because I think that violence assumes intent, right? There's an intent to do harm here, and I think that when you're talking about a dysregulated 6-year-old child with a disability, you're not talking about intent. You're talking most often. I mean, and I think you bring up kind of seeing something really similar here. But I mean, when we talk about children who have been restrained and secluded, when I really get below the surface of understanding what happened, what I find is it often started for noncompliance or minor behaviors. And what's below the surface is a child whose needs we have failed to appropriately meet. If we had appropriately met their needs, they would have not have ended up in a situation where they became dysregulated, where they had the big behavior. But that language gets used on the children. And I think it's really unfair because, these are kids that are having a hard time. They're not necessarily trying to give you a hard time. They're often not getting the support that they need. But when we use language to either sanitize the practices or describe the individuals differently, it perpetuates the system, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder why this description of violence towards children is so easy to go to. And it really brings you back to that zero tolerance policy,
Right.
the framing of kids as violent, as super predators.
Right.
That permeates that language and has really taken a deep root in public schools. And I think that coming into this space, in the seclusion and restraint space, as a school suspension scholar who's done the work on zero tolerance, it really helps you understand how a deeply rooted culture against, school discipline reform can situate itself in schools where we have school discipline reform laws across the country, but many schools have admitted we've been doing this for 30 years. It works great for us. And I've had administrators tell me, until you pass a law that punishes me for continuously punishing this kid, I'm going to continue to do it because there's no consequences for them to do it.
Right.
So I think that's
and that brings up something kind of interesting, which is, part of the work that we do is trying to get better laws and policies, right? I think that's important, but the better laws and policies alone don't get you to where you need to be. You really need to change kind of the mindset, the approaches, the practices that are in place, because you can put a better law in place that gets rid of seclusion, but if you're not getting to people the better things they can and should do and changing the mindset, well, then what happens? Seclusion gets replaced with suspension or referrals to law enforcement or other things like that. And I think changing that perspective and mindset is so important. But one of the things that we've found looking across the country, and of course, one of the problems here is we have no federal law, right? There's no federal law around restraint and seclusion in schools around the nation, despite the fact that it has been introduced and reintroduced several times. And as a result, all the states are on their own in terms of what their laws say. And one of the things we continuously see is even in the laws or the states rather, that have better laws, so often those laws are not enforceable or enforced at all. So these things happen. I mean, I go back to my own situation. If you looked at what Maryland law said at the time my son was restrained and secluded, we had a really high standard. We had the imminent serious physical harm. He would not have met that criteria. He should never have been restrained and secluded. But more often than not, that's the case. I mean, I would say and I'd be curious to your thoughts, but very often, when I look at the instances that we're aware of kids being restrained and secluded, I would say the exception to the rule would be that there was a situation that involved the imminent threat of serious physical harm. I mean, that's a potentially life-threatening situation, right? I would say 95 to 98% of what I see is not at all related to that kind of situation.
Exactly. Throwing
Yeah.
toys. I've had parents tell me their kid was dragged into a seclusion room for eating snow. That's
Mm.
not dangerous or imminent. So
Yeah.
it's those kind of situations. Singing too loudly in Spanish
Yep,
class.
yep. I know that story well, and I mean I know so many others like him. Looking at the settlement thing from the Department of Justice yesterday, spilling a cup of coffee. Okay, that got you secluded and restrained. I
Yeah.
mean that's absolutely absurd. I want to just point out a couple more people that had jumped in to say hello. Chantel, our lead Canadian volunteer, actually here from British Columbia. Glad to have you here, Chantel. We've got Paula here from Massachusetts, and Stacy just jumping in to say this happens all too often. Chantel mentioned the seclusion incident that she first found out about with her daughter was incredibly traumatic, and that's a good segue to where we're heading with this. Not only for her, but also for the other children who had to watch it happen, and it goes deeper than that. Not just for her and the other children, but for the family, for the caregiver, for the and quite frankly, I mean, one of the things that we found is it's traumatic also for the staff. Yet the more they do it, the more they become traumatized, the more likely they are to do it again. And the same happens with a child's behavior. The more they're restraining and secluding, the more we're going to see a dysregulated child, the more we're going to see behavior. Another welcome here, Carly from Massachusetts. Good to have you here. Sarah, we've got an active chat going on here today, happening daily in a well-known children's hospital program in Halifax with white autistic biological children in a program that they say, uses CPS, collaborative proactive solutions or collaborative problem-solving model. So a school that you wouldn't expect to be using those kinds of things. Grandma guardian of a child, autism spectrum disorder, Tourette's, who was secluded over 100 times. Oh my goodness, before first grade. And again, I always ask this, Charles, but I mean, how often is a 5 or 6-year-old really presenting the imminent threat of serious physical harm? I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's not very probable that this 45-pound child is really posing that grave of a danger. But what we see in the stats are it happens much more to the much younger children who, guess what, are smaller and easier to control.
Exactly.
Yeah. A number of other comments here. Somebody else jumped in and said, same with Illinois, has strong rules against seclusion and restraint. And a lot of that happened in the wake of that quiet room story that you mentioned earlier. But again, even with the strong rules, it doesn't mean that you've avoided from happening. Stacy jumped in and said that she's ordered the book and will get it in Mexico. Okay, via Texas. There we go. Great. I'm going to pause for a second on all the comments here, and I want to dive into a few more things. So getting into the book, and Chantel mentioned kind of the trauma. Chapter 2, you talk about school-induced trauma and parental health outcomes. This was really interesting to me because in writing this book, you talked to a number of families who had experienced with restraint and seclusion. You talked to a number of folks in higher ed as well. You made a lot of effort to reach and connect with teachers, but had less luck, connecting with some of the staff. But in those conversations, especially with the parents, I mean, these are tough. I've had a lot of these conversations. I know how hard they are, even just to hear. But talk to us a little bit about what you were finding, because this is really impactful. It's easy to say, well, it's traumatic for the parents as well. But what you really demonstrated was it actually was affecting health outcomes and all sorts of other things. So talk to us a little bit about the trauma, both for the child and the families that were involved that you talked to.
Certainly. So immediately, in my research, I knew I was going to ask questions about how this was impacting children. And as you alluded to before, a few minutes ago, I noticed that many of these children had engaged in playful activities that were criminalized, that got them dragged into seclusion rooms. And then their behavior escalated as a result of being in the seclusion room and the trauma sets in, but no one recognizes that in the school. They're just busy criminalizing behavior. They're not looking for the source of the trauma or the behavior. And seclusion and restraint is undoubtedly one of the sources of the trauma and behavior of the trauma. So I think that was really important to understand. But night terrors, many of these children were kicking and screaming, please don't ever send me back to school anymore because they keep putting me in the closet.
Right.
Some of these children, of course, were nonverbal, so they couldn't voice what was happening to them. Some of these children were drawing themselves in the seclusion room because they're having nightmares about it at night. I thought that was just so devastating for a parent to see and to not know what was going on. You don't know what's going on. Your child is drawing these things or having night terrors. And then you learn that, hey, I've been dropping my kid off every day. And I'm thinking they're in school learning. And in reality, you're in this closet for 3 to 4 hours a day. It was just so devastating for parents. And then I did not initially have a question on parents' health. But this is one thing that I've always said I love about qualitative research is that you can pick up on cues and you could hear the challenges that parents were having in their voices. You can see how it was wearing on them, how the trauma associated with restraint and seclusion isolated them from their families, from people who didn't know. And this is one of the reasons I wrote the book is that many people just don't know that this is so traumatizing that it affects children's behavior. And when we see children acting out, we don't think that, hey, is this a child who's been restrained or secluded and they're acting out of trauma?
Right.
And immediately, if you call law enforcement or you are taking the wrong approach, you're actually participating in the criminalization of this child's behavior rather than intervening to get them the help they need.
Right.
So it was really important to voice that in the book and make sure those voices were actually heard. I had a few parents tell me that they, and this is really tough, that they were contemplating suicide.
Oh.
And that really hit me hard because it really it showed that this particular issue, as they had been isolated from friends, isolated from families, they had no one they felt they could talk to, they could trust.
Well, and it's interesting because I mean, I've shared this before, but if you're the parent of a child who is a child with an IEP getting, services under special education, you are a smaller subset of the population, right? But you have people within that group that understand you and understand the challenges that you have. If you happen to find your child being restrained and secluded, you're a smaller subset even there. And many of the people that might have understood you in that space before haven't experienced what you experienced. They didn't have that. So suddenly people that before you could connect to didn't understand. And I've seen it where, parents that bring these issues to light, suddenly other parents that are concerned from the other end begin pushing back and saying, oh no, that school doesn't do that. They don't do that kind of thing. We've never had any problem. It's all fine. And it really can be. I mean, it really can be isolating. And I mean, I can tell you, firsthand, not only, from all the people that I've talked to that have been affected by this, but, my own experience. I mean, there is nothing that cuts deeper than having your child harmed in a place that you're sending them to be supported and cared for. I mean, you can probably read the story here, but I was so upset by what had been done to my son. I quit my job and started a nonprofit to advocate for change. I was just so shocked by this is not okay. But, as I was reading your book and just hearing about like the health conditions, I mean, these are things that are very much aligned with like the kinds of things you learned about with the adverse childhood study, right? I mean, these traumas can have an effect causing chronic health conditions and other things within the families and parents. And again, parents or caregivers who are sometimes convinced by the school with the language they might be like, oh, well, he had to spend a little time in the call. They don't understand really what's going on. But then at some point, imagine the wave of guilt when you realize like, oh, this is what was happening and this was the impact. And I know people that have not even managed to negotiate that because for them to understand that they were sending them somewhere that harm was being done takes a big kind of leap. There's a lawmaker actually right now in Minnesota whose son was restrained and secluded. who is advocating to roll back a law prohibiting the use of seclusion in like pre-K through third grade, because she formed this belief that somehow seclusion was necessary and helpful for her child, and hasn't been able to see the harm that was caused by it. So I mean, it really can be so impactful in that area.
Certainly, it's devastating.
Yeah.
And just seeing the snowball effect of, not only is it affecting the child, not only is it impacting parents. There's one example in the book that I give where there's a child who's clearly traumatized from being placed in the seclusion room so many times, crying, and instead of calling home to talk to mom about it, they pulled his twin sister out of class
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah.
exposed her to the trauma of
Right.
seeing her brother dysregulated and frustrated because they keep doing this to him, which causes her to
Mm,
to cry and get traumatized because of this.
right.
So it really just shows the trauma is it's magnified across communities. There's another example where a child was eloping
Mm,
because, again, repeat attempts of dragging his kid to the seclusion room and locking them inside.
right.
Eloped, and the school called the police on him. And on the neighbor's ring camera, they captured this altercation where law enforcement is coming to this 10-year-old kid with Pokemon cards. They have guns drawn on them. Put your hands in the air. And that's so traumatizing for a
Right.
kid. And
Right.
why would you call, instead of calling parents and asking where would this kid go, you call the police. And
Right.
the description they gave was just completely inappropriate
Mm,
for the context of the situations. Of course, law enforcement overreacts because they were given improper descriptions of the
right.
situation at hand.
Right. Yeah. So in writing this book, you talked to how many families did you talk to? I mean, I know there were just multiple stories, and you kind of came back to some of them throughout the book. How many families did you talk to when you?
50 families.
Wow, wow, from across the country.
Yes, there's
Yeah,
at least 16 different states. I know
yeah,
I said 15 in the book, but I forgot one. Yeah.
yeah. What was there anything that really surprised you as you got further in, as you were talking to the families? I mean, what were the things that, I mean, you've been a academic and had your own lived experience in the world of punitive discipline and all of that. But I'm sure the deeper you got down this, there were probably some surprises. Anything that really surprised you as you were talking to families?
Certainly. One thing with the families and one thing with the academics.
Okay.
Um, of course, the expenses associated with
Yeah.
challenging school restraint and seclusion. Parents told me they spent up to $300,000 suing schools. And then in cases where parents were actually successful, the school forced them to sign a non disclosure agreement. And
Right. Right.
I took some time to really reflect on what that means because, as I talked earlier, there's no admission of wrongdoing.
Mm, mm.
So if you're caught restraining and secluding one child, that means you're probably doing it to other children as well.
Right. Right.
But when you force a parent to sign a non disclosure agreement, that means, okay, we agree in this case because you had the resources to successfully launch a challenge in court that we will stop doing it here. But we don't want you talking to other parents
Right.
because we really like to seclude and restrain kids. And that's really what really bothered me, the
Right. Right.
culture and the intentionality behind it.
Right.
There was no understanding or awareness or willingness to accept that this was traumatizing kids.
Right.
They just wanted to keep doing it and they wanted parents to be quiet about it.
Right.
There's
Right.
another example
Right.
I'll give you. There's another family where they'd spent $90,000 in a lawsuit, and the school said that they would give the parents $15,000 back, but they wanted a gag order on the parents. So again, we just want you to stop talking about it because
Right.
we don't want this to make the news
Right.
and other families know about it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, that's why we do this work at the Alliance, is that, for my son who's doing really well today, and we've been able to, heal past the trauma and get him the support he needed, and he's doing fantastic. It was about all the kids that were left behind and all the kids that didn't have a voice, and all the families who had been gaslit by the school into believing
mhm,
things that simply weren't true. And there's a lot that happens. I mean, one of the things that we've seen is that there's a lot of families that they'll kind of understand the harm that's being done and feel like they've got no choice but to pull their children out and perhaps homeschool their children. And sure, that's a possibility for some families, but not every family's in a position where that is even a feasible thing that they could do. And that creates a real issue there, that families that might not be in an economic position where they could do something like that, their children are still going into a place that is causing harm. And if we don't address that, you also mentioned in the book kind of like these virtual school options, which again, left with no option, often are pushed into virtual options, which may be quite a different experience and may not be giving, children really what they need. But it becomes a kind of after COVID, that those options begin to get a little bit more prominent. Talk to us a little bit about, kind of that and not just the virtual school piece, but, parents pulling their kids out and some of the things that you heard about that parents were doing when they just felt like there was nothing else they could do to change it. Because there is nothing worse than sending your child to a place. And this is where I got, where it was like, I can't send my son back there. This is dangerous. He could get really harmed. So talk a little bit about that, if you would, about some of these options that parents end up with that are not necessarily great options, but they're all that's available.
Certainly. So I had several parents tell me they're never going to send their kids to a public school ever again. And they had no idea what homeschool actually looked like,
Right.
but they were dedicated to figuring it out. They knew it was not the best placement for them, but they're in this really tough situation where I may not have all the educational resources at home that a public school has, but I'm not locking my kid in the closet either.
Right.
And that's a really tough situation to be in as a parent. Parents also told me that they were sending their kids to virtual school because, again, their kid was being protected from restraint and seclusion.
Right.
And this was, for parents, a very shocking opportunity because during COVID, it was the first time that many parents could actually observe their kids and see that, hey, my child is not doing what you said they were doing at school.
Right.
Because I talked to parents and they told me their kid was being restrained and secluded. And I asked them what were the behaviors that they felt warranted restraint and seclusion. And the parents told me the school wouldn't let them in the door to even observe their kid. So virtual school during COVID was the first opportunity many parents were able to see that, hey, my kid loves learning. My kid loves reading. They're just not being restrained and secluded. Hey, I'm starting to connect these dots. And now I'm never going to send my kid back to school ever again. So.
Yeah. And of course, again, the restraint and seclusion leads to trauma. It leads to trauma, leads to leads the behavior, because a child that has experienced a lot of trauma is more likely to be hypervigilant, more likely to have stress-related behavior. And if the reaction to that or the response to that are, demands for compliance and restraint, then you're going to feed a cycle that's going to have a child that doesn't feel safe. And you can't learn when you don't feel safe. You can't learn if you feel like you're in a constant state of threat. So I want to transition a little bit. In addition to talking to families, which again, the stories in the book are really impactful. And in addition to talking to families, you also you made an effort, I think, to find educators to talk to, and you can talk a little bit about that. But then I know you also ended up talking to quite a few people kind of in higher ed, trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we, what do we do differently? I'm a big guy about going upstream. I'm always talking about, like, we need to go upstream to fix this problem. And higher ed is like what we need to do differently. And frankly, in my opinion, and I think your book kind of underscores this as well, like, they're still running pretty behind in a lot of this. So talk to us a little bit about kind of the exploration to talk to actual educators in schools, and also what your conversations in higher ed look like.
So I was really shocked initially because I have in my prior book, I interviewed teachers on their experiences being threatened or attacked and had no problem recruiting teachers whatsoever. I have lots of contacts at teachers unions, and I could not find any teachers that would talk about their experiences restraining or secluding a child. I was able to do one interview with a teacher who a colleague sent to me, and that interview was deeply powerful. It was deeply informative because in this particular interview, this is a parent who told me that she had a child with autism, wanted to go back into schools to help, got a master's degree in education, and interviewed for a position. And during the interview, the they asked her to place a child in a seclusion room. And that speaks volumes to me
Right,
because
right.
it really
That
raises the
it's so normalized. This thing
yeah,
that should be a crisis management option only in a very, you know, I mean, the fact that this would make it to, I mean, that shocked me when I read that. I mean, the fact
yeah,
that that would make it to an interview process, like, oh, let's see if you can restrain a child, or let's, I mean, and you know, I've heard stories before that just turn my stomach about staff that would intentionally wind a child up to show people what to do when they were dysregulated. It was like,
wow.
yeah, yeah, it's unbelievable sometimes these things that happen.
Yeah, I was just completely mind blown. But it really raised an important question, though, because it raised the question of what are school administrators looking for when they hire teachers? Are they looking for teachers who are not trained
Right,
in understanding the harms associated with exclusion and restraint, or are willing to ignore such training
right, right,
to
right,
get employment? But going to the higher ed piece, when I talk to professors, education professors, and program directors, I interviewed them at 20 programs. And before I even go into the interviews, I'm going to say that there needs to be a national study on all school stakeholders training in school seclusion and restraint and school punishment broadly. Because when I talk to them, very few programs within that 20 programs that I interviewed had offered any sort of course on school punishment. Almost none of them offered courses or instruction on restraint and seclusion. So the problem here is that you're sending teachers into the school environment with none of the preparation that they need to know best practices or to know that when they see something on a job that this is wrong and it's harmful. So when you are taking a job and you just happen to take a job in one of those high staunch zero tolerance schools that loves to suspend kids, loves to punish kids, well, you're going to fall right into that same trap because you don't possess any of the knowledge to know anything
right,
different.
right,
And
right,
then I also I also learned from those interviews that teachers have a alternative pathway into the profession
right,
where they learn, not only do they not learn all the school punishment stuff or school seclusion and restraint, they don't get any training on social emotional development either.
right,
And
right.
that's 20% of teachers. In Texas, there's actually more teachers taking the alternative route than the university route.
Right, right. And we
So,
often have a high number of teachers that are in that situation working in special education classrooms. Some of the most challenging environments that we might have that require, you know, probably more, not less, you know.
exactly.
Yeah,
So it was really telling to interview program directors and ask them, what do you think are the reasons that teachers are misusing their practices or seclusion restraint practices? And overwhelmingly, well, they're not trained, poor training. And then when I asked them, well, what courses do you offer on training? Well, we really don't offer any. So it's
right,
almost as if,
right,
do you see that you're kind of part of the problem here? Because
right,
you have researchers who are doing this research, and how does a study on school seclusion and restraint and school suspension broadly, how does that not make it into
mm,
the education curriculum?
right,
And as a criminologist, I'll say this. It was deeply disturbing to me to know that some of my criminal justice students were getting a better education on school punishment than some teachers were getting
mm,
across the
mm.
country.
Wow, wow. Yeah, you know, we've talked about this before, but I think, you know, there's a couple things at play here, but one of them certainly is the lack of, you know, the lack of education in these areas. You know, you can become a first year teacher, never having learned anything about things like restraint and seclusion. So you arrive at your first position, and you know, let's say that you're working in an environment where they're using restraint and seclusion, and you have a situation arise and somebody says, oh, well, this is what we do when those children are doing this. um, as a first year teacher and not having been exposed to this, you might feel like that doesn't feel right to me, or that seems wrong, but somebody in authority is telling you to do it. And you know, unfortunately, you know, Dr. Bell, this is something I believe very strongly. We're so focused on compliance in so many of our environments that first year teacher goes, okay, well, I don't, you know, really like the idea. Well, then you begin to do these things, and then you begin to believe that they're the only thing that you can do. And I think that focus on compliance that comes in our education system today can actually turn out people that come out of that and don't say, well, this isn't right. But I've known people like that, and I've known educators, and I'm sure you have as well, that have left jobs or done other things because these things don't feel right to them. But very often you find people doing them just because well, that's what they're telling me to do, and I guess that's what I should be doing. It's really, really, really unfortunate. Um, so, definitely shortcomings there in terms of teacher training. Definitely, I think a lot of challenges, and I agree with you. I mean, that absolutely is something that has to be addressed here. Um, I have a lot of concern that what happens is, I mean, for instance, what happens is, teachers get training in crisis management, and, I've actually been through some of that training before. And if you go through a whole program, it's often a 4-day, 5-day program in de-escalation and restraint. But when it comes back to the schools, they often follow a train the trainer model. And very often the trainer that goes out and gets 5 days of training, they come back and they compress it into a day or half a day, and they focus on the physical part. They focus on the restraints. And if that's what you're teaching people, that's what they're more likely to use. So, I mean, I think that there are substantial issues around the training that happens there as well, and the requirements that may be in place in terms of what that training looks like. Now that said, I'm a believer in, like, let's go upstream and figure out why this is happening in the first place rather than trying to figure out, a technique for restraining. But certainly those things are aligned. I'm kind of curious. So our position here around restraint and seclusion is that we don't believe that restraint is something that should be used unless it meets that very high criteria, which is put out in the federal guidance. It says it's a crisis, you've tried all else you can try, and it's needed to avoid the threat of imminent serious physical harm to that child or someone else. And of course, that threshold of imminent serious physical harm is a very high standard. It is not noncompliance. It is not disrespect. It is not minor behavior. It's not singing out loud in Spanish class. It's not dumping a cup of coffee on the ground. It is, if we don't intervene, someone could actually die. I mean, imminent serious physical harm, it's a 4-part definition, but it's a likelihood of death. Quite frankly, I think that standard is appropriate because we know that children have died being physically restrained. And of course, the question I come back to always is, when do you use, potentially deadly force on a dysregulated 6-year-old? I mean, these things should not be happening commonly. So we kind of believe that restraint should be really exceedingly rare. The circumstances that might raise to that level should not be things that are happening frequently. And in terms of seclusion, we kind of come at this from, I don't believe there's ever an appropriate use of seclusion. I don't believe putting a child in a room like the rooms that you talked about, the rooms with blood on the floor. I don't believe putting a child in a room like that and not letting them out is ever something we should do. And even, I mean, you mentioned, like, the room having padding and things like that, but even with a padded room, it does not protect a child from the psychosocial harm that happens when you isolate them in that kind of environment. So we kind of have this belief that, like, restraint should really be something that's rare, really kind of under a pretty high bar. And in our opinion, seclusion is something that should completely go away, and shouldn't be happening. You kind of talk in the conclusion of kind of rethinking restraint and seclusion. Tell me a little bit more kind of where your thoughts are, where you would like to see things go as well.
Certainly. And I think we are aligned. And I think
Yeah.
that these tactics are horrific and should never exist in a public school ever. But sitting back, being a realist, I know that you can't get the entire country to agree on anything. So, exactly. So, my thinking was that we would get to this point of recognizing how harmful this is by multiple ways. The first thing is adequate training. I believe if you're leading a training and you're really showing those photos, if you're showing the trauma associated with restraining seclusion, the next question is, why are we doing it? And there's no justification. You can't justify the violence that's in those photos in the book. You can't justify the
Yeah.
trauma. You can't justify that. So there's really no justification for doing it. If we can't teach it and have it safe, and there's no way to make it safe, you can't do it. So I
Right.
think there's multiple ways where you could get to this point where we recognize that this is so harmful that it should not exist. I just think that it's going to take different parts of the country different stages or different
Yeah.
pathways
Yeah.
to get to that end stage where we realize that we have to really rethink this.
Right. Right.
And I think that some parts of the country are there,
Right.
and they have passed laws. And what I really want them to understand is that even if you have a state law that bans restraint and seclusion or restricts it, some schools are circumventing the law using
Right.
these,
Oh yeah,
euphemisms.
and there's lots. I mean, and there's I kind of say to people often that if you want to reduce restraint and seclusion significantly, the one thing you need to teach people right away is what the state law actually says in their state. Because
Mhm.
more often than not, I find that people that are restraining and secluding do not even really understand what the state law says around restraint and seclusion. If you understand that the threshold says imminent serious physical harm and you know what that means, then you should not be restraining a child for throwing something on the floor. But more often than not, people don't really understand, and they conflate this idea of um, unsafe with imminent serious physical harm. Those two things are not the same. They're not even in the same category. There's a lot of things that may be unsafe or unpreferable or not, not something we want to see happen. But that imminent threat of serious physical harm is a very high standard. That's one piece of it. Just being aware of what those things say, I think,
Mhm.
is so critical. One of the other things I was going to hit on, you talked about kind of like what it takes to get there. We actually did have done some collaboration with, and of all strange things, we did some collaboration with Crisis Prevention Institute, which is one of the largest providers of training in restraint and de-escalation in the country. And we work with them on a couple of things. We had some influence over their newest nonviolent crisis intervention training. And not to say that it's all that I would want it to be, but one of the pieces of feedback that they took from us that was meaningful to me was the impact of restraint on a child, the impact that it could lead to trauma. And when they introduced their latest version of their training, they actually have these voice of lived experience videos where they talk about what the impact of being physically restrained was. And to me, that's progress. I mean, I want to see more progress. And of course, what's interesting is they're the largest crisis management training provider in the country.
Certainly.
They do not support or endorse the use of seclusion, full stop.
Mhm.
And in fact, when we began to do some work together, it only happened after we kind of agreed that we shared some common goals, and they put out a press release saying that they were aligned with us in reducing the use of restraint, eliminating the use of seclusion. But people that are out there doing these things in the name of these companies sometimes don't even realize what the training really says, because
Exactly.
they've been trained by somebody that was trained by somebody that was trained by somebody, and
Mhm.
here you have really bad practices that continue to flourish and cause a lot of harm.
Yeah.
I want to turn back to our comments because we had a lot of activity going here, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I just want to kind of take a look here and see what we have here in the comments. I had somebody here, Carly said, I have a child who has been restrained for noncompliance, but was really dyslexic. It was incredibly traumatic. I'm here trying to learn all from you. Thanks for being here, and we're happy to support you, and you're welcome to reach out as well. And of course, one of the powerful things about this book, Dr. Bell, is this is something that I would encourage you, if you're a parent or a family that's going through this, get a copy of this book and share it with your school. Sometimes it seems like they don't want to listen to you as a parent. We have an academic researcher here that did really, I think, an amazing job digging into this topic. And again, there are resources out there that we can use. A couple other things here. Let's see. Let's see. Stacy said, I can tell you as an educator who's been in a classroom setting with students who have had a meltdown, it's never the child's fault ever. Right. I mean, when we see that, we know that that's a signal that we're not giving them the support or what they may need to be successful. Carlene asked if it was being recorded, and we always record these. And not only do we record these, we encourage you to share them with others. So if you're a parent, share them with other parents, share them with your schools. That's the way we get some of this shared. Let's see what we have here. And Courtney, of course, mentioned that we've got a 30% discount on the book with the code NYUAU30, and that's in the chat there as well. Gosh, we had a lot of conversation going here, Dr. Bell. You've sparked something here. I got some good thanks here for sharing all of this. And look at this. Okay. And I think this comment came when we were talking about, kind of parents that may have a hard time acknowledging the harm that's done, and absolutely, this can be a source of moral injury as well. And I got something here from Jocelyn yesterday at our district meeting. The child asked for the door to be closed. It was a good thing. No. They are scared of you and they want to be far away from you. This is something that we hear a lot. And I always try to make the distinction with the work that we do, like seclusion, for example. Putting a child in a room or area against their will and not letting them out, never, ever should we be doing that. Are there children who need a quiet place to go from time to time? Yeah, yeah. There may be a child that benefits from having a play, but on their own terms, and they can leave when they want. And in this example, I mean, sometimes what I hear is, well, they want to be in there, and this always shocks me because having seen some of these rooms like you have, it's hard for me to imagine because what we know, I'm curious on your take on this, but if you look at the use of seclusion, we often find these rooms actually built directly into special education classrooms. Now, I find that problematic. I find that showing an intent to discriminate against kids with disabilities, right? But we often find them built in those classrooms. I have a real hard time believing that if you're dragging a kid against their will and putting them in this room, shutting the door, and the child is going to bang and they're going to scream and they're going to hit their head and they're going to call for loved ones while they're in that room, that another child would go, oh, I think I might want to go there sometime. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. But we hear that kind of thing. Did you hear anything like that in your research?
Yeah, I've heard kids wanting to get out,
Right.
never wanting to get in the room.
That's right. That's
So
right.
it really just shows you that some teachers are using this as a convenience,
Absolutely.
And I also want to touch on this point that you made about building the room into special education classrooms. And it really shows you the lack of imagination around the inclusion of children with disabilities in public schools. It's almost as if school staff are saying we can't include these kids unless we can restrain and seclude them. And I've even in the book, I've talked to parents who told me, administrators said, if we can't restrain and seclude, we have no programs for you.
Right.
Nothing.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And that happens. That happens a lot. And I had a district recently that was arguing that without seclusion, that they're going to have to send more kids out of district. So without this very important tool in their toolbox, that they're going to have to send more kids out of district, that incurs a higher cost. And it's like, no. You should be investing time, energy, and effort into supporting children without needing to use a practice like this.
Exactly.
Yeah. I've got a question here. This is a long one, but it's asking about resources or to recommend how to reintroduce a special education student back into the school environment once they've been traumatized by restraint and seclusion. Our son's new collaborative school is very patient with his fear, and he's had positive experiences when he does attend. We're trying to encourage continued attendance, but it's a very slow process, and we lose ground with every vacation, school break. Rewards don't always work. Rewards don't work. And we're left without much else to motivate him. I mean, this is a tough one because I'm sure you found the same. I mean, I know kids that just restrained or secluded one time may not feel safe going back into that environment.
Mhm.
And what's interesting to me, and this is something we see frequently, where a child is restrained or secluded, this really traumatic event, okay, being physically restrained or being forced into seclusion is a very traumatic event. And it happens on a Monday, and they expect the kid to be back in school on Tuesday as if nothing happened. Why do you think there's such a big blind spot to that school-based trauma that often happens? And then the road that leads us down is that, okay, well, we're just going to have to get them used to coming back. Like, school is something scary to my nervous system. I don't feel safe going there. So why do you think there's such a blind spot? And do you have any recommendations based on your research on how to help reintroduce a child back to an environment once it's been kind of something that is known to be traumatic for the child?
I think that's one of the reasons I wrote this book is so that schools that are doing this, of course, will understand the harms, but other schools that are dealing with students who are leaving those punitive institutions and wanting to re-enroll in other schools, they could understand how harmful this was to a child, and they can create a space for the child to talk about it. I think it's so
Yep.
important for that child to be able to say that this is what seclusion did to me. This is
Right.
why I'm afraid of
Right.
it.
Right.
And for them to hear from a school staff member that I would never do this to you.
Right.
So I think that there's and I've published another paper, and I kind of talked about this in the book too, betrayal trauma.
Mm.
Because when you think about this, parents are building a relationship with their children from birth. And then at the point in which you enroll your child in school, you are literally informally communicating to your child that you can trust this school staff
Right.
member,
Right. Right.
only for that school staff member
Right.
to place this kid in this seclusion. So there is a
Which can
broken
actually
relationship.
destroy the relationship with the parent. I mean, we've seen this happen time and time
Mhm.
again where you're sending me to this place and I'm being harmed, and now I no longer trust you. I
Exactly.
mean, it can really have a negative effect. You know, Carlene, this is something really, really difficult, and what I would say to you, and there's a lot more we could go into, but relational safety is where it begins. You know, finding connection and building relationship with some individuals at the school, and that might need to even happen outside of the school, because if the
Yep.
school is a source of trauma, you might have to begin building that relationship elsewhere to make it safe for them to go back. But focusing on the relationship, I think, is really critical. Making sure the school is very, very well aligned with trauma informed approaches is really important as well. And of course, you know, rewards are a common approach, but rewards are not going to help here. I
Mm.
mean, in fact, what I would say to you, I'm not a big proponent for rewards. You know, there's actually a kind of a lot of research that shows kind of the dark side of rewards. It's a power over type of intervention, and it can lead to anxiety and mistrust and a lot of other things.
Mhm.
And especially for kids that have experienced trauma, you know, when you begin to assign their value to them meeting the thing you want them to do, you know. So there's a lot of things you can do. Keep following us and we'll try to offer some help, and feel free to reach out if we can help you with anything. Lisa shared that Indiana stopped releasing the numbers of seclusions and restraint in schools in 2022 or
Yep.
2023.
That's
Lisa,
surprising.
that is horrible. We should
Mhm.
get that law changed. We should have accountability. It is very different from state to state. Some states, you know, do make this data available. Some do not. Some don't report it at all. Of course, there are federal reporting requirements to the Office of Civil Rights, but as you probably know all too well, that data is not very good. There's a lot of underreporting that happens. But, you know, Lisa, this is something that you can influence a change in, you know, by talking to lawmakers in your state. You know, there's always a possibility of getting that as a requirement to get that data released. And certainly we would back you up on that. It's important. We've got a lot of other things here as well. Let's see. Somebody's okay. I'm just talking about their own experience here. Gosh, this really stimulated a lot of conversation, discussion here. We were reaching about the end of our time here, but I just want to look through these comments here real quick. Yeah, a couple really tragic stories. You know, the truth of the matter is, and you know, Dr. Bell, I just want to say to you, you know, I really appreciate you know, your curiosity and your work in these areas of punitive and exclusionary discipline, of restraint and seclusion. This is important work that is really affecting the outcomes for so many kids. And you know, whether it be, you know, the trauma that they endure through this, or you know, the lack of real education, because you know, you're not getting education when you're being restrained and secluded, when you don't feel safe at school. So I really appreciate all the work that you've been doing in these areas. What you know, in addition to this book coming out now, what else is on your radar in terms of things that you're going to be focused on moving forward?
You know, I'm looking at school-based retaliation. That's something that
Uh,
emerged unexpectedly in my interviews in school suspensions and in school seclusion and restraints. I did not expect schools to behave in this kind of way, and I'm sure parents were completely caught off guard, filing false CPS claims against parents, targeting spouses who worked at the school, targeting witnesses. I want to know the exact extent of this. In a separate paper that's not in this book on school suspensions, advocates who are on school boards, they told me that they were targeted. In one case, one board member who won their seat and had been in it for 21 years, their seat was removed in a redistricting process. So
mhm.
you see that everyone is up for grabs. It's not just parents. Even students told me that not only were they punished initially, which prompted the advocacy, but then parents retaliated against. And then the child also experienced retaliation. Their graduation requirements, they thought they were on a diploma track to go to college, and their courses were switched. And of course, they're on this track where they're not eligible for college anymore. So I would love to know the extent of the retaliations, because again, this is really showing you the structural violence that is manifested in
Right.
public schools, the
Right.
intent to harm a child by changing their classes
Yeah.
maliciously, you know.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can share with you that we hear a lot of retaliation in the families that we support and talk to. And in fact, I see a couple of comments here as well. Stacy said, I'd love to discuss retaliation from schools. It is wild, like the mafia. Um, Carly says, we've faced that numerous times. If you ever need a family story, we'd love to speak to you. Is there a place where people can reach out to you if they're interested in connecting or sharing more or, maybe being part of any future research that you might be doing?
Sure, if you go to my website, my email address is listed. You can contact me there,
Okay.
charlesbillphd.com. I
Okay.
would love to talk to you and learn more about your story.
Yeah, yeah, and I appreciate that. Retaliation also against teachers that stand up, and that's absolutely
Yeah,
true. This is something else we've seen, and I've known and become close to teachers that have experienced this. Teachers who stood up against restraint and seclusion were effective in reducing the use of it. Were at one point, kind of highlighted by the district for their great work in doing that, and later were retaliated against when they didn't want to teach the use of restraint. So I mean, you see these things happen on all sides. And in fact, a lot of our volunteers here at the Alliance are people that have had experiences, and the intersection of teachers whose own children have been restrained or secluded is much more significant than you might imagine. And unfortunately, it doesn't matter who you are when this is happening to your child. The system, and that's the thing. The system is what's broken here. The children aren't broken. Again, I understand the journey that an educator might end up going down. And I certainly understand that most educators become educators because they want to help kids, they want to support kids. They don't become educators because they want to restrain and seclude kids. But when you get into a bad system, when you get into a system that's not working, when you get into a system that doesn't support you, it's easy for things to flip at some point where you suddenly begin to see the children differently and that you begin to see yourself differently. And that can result in us kind of doing more and more of these things that are really harmful. So, again, I think the system very often is what's broken here. So we have just about reached the end of our time here. In fact, I think I told you an hour. We're a little over an hour here, but we're going to wrap up. But as we do, I want to again, of course, thank you for being here today, and again, encourage people. I just got my copy in the mail yesterday, so it's out there. It's shipping. I know we've shared the link to it and also the coupon code. But get a copy, and again, if you find that it's helpful and useful, share it with your school's team. This is meaningful research that can be helpful in understanding the impact of what's happening here. So I want to encourage you to do that as well. But I want to give you a final opportunity, Dr. Bell. Anything you want to share with us as we're wrapping up? Any final thoughts or any hopes for the future? I certainly got a lot of hopes, but any final thoughts you want to share with us today?
I hope this book really shows families that, again, you're not the problem. It's a system.
Right.
I think it's really easy for a system that's as massive and powerful as a school system to point out and isolate a family and say it's you, you're the problem, and you feel so alone. But when you have 50 interviews with different families across the country, and you can connect the dots between the intentional mischaracterization of restraint and seclusion as quiet room, calm
Mm.
down room,
Yep.
padded room, it shows a systematic intent to deceive families, to deceive state and federal governments, so that we never understand how harmful these tactics are and how widely they are used. And I'll leave you with this. I actually contacted the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. I wanted to know if they had data on four questions. And the first few of them were, could you provide data, or did you have data to show the earliest grade level in which students are restrained or secluded?
Mhm.
They had none.
Yep.
Are you tracking if students are how many students are leaving school following being restrained or seclusion? They had no data. So it really
It's
shows.
that's significant. I know
Yeah,
well that that's significant.
yeah. I just couldn't believe.
Yeah.
I asked 4 questions and they had no data on any of them. So it's
Mhm.
on us. It's on
Yeah.
researchers. It's
Yep.
on it's on people like
Yep.
us to
Yep.
really put this together and
Yep.
show the extent and the harm to get to that point where we encourage society to rethink our school systems and to reimagine special education without
Mm.
these rooms.
Right, right, right. And it's absolutely possible. I mean, we have entire states now that have banned the use of seclusion. We have, schools and systems that have done a fantastic job reducing the use of restraint. Absolutely, it's possible. And what's interesting is that, what I found is that the schools that reduce and eliminate these practices, they improve the outcomes, not just for kids, but for teachers and staff. That then trickles down to the parents and the caregivers and the community. The same things that are gonna improve outcomes for the children are gonna improve outcomes for all. But it's hard work, and we've got to acknowledge that we have broken systems, and that's okay. Let's figure out what we're gonna do about it, because it's that Maya Angelou quote that I share every presentation. It's to do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. We know better when it comes to restraint seclusion. Now it's time to do better, and we should pass federal law. This is absurd that we have no federal law around this.
Yes.
The bill has been reintroduced. It was reintroduced in December, the Keeping All Students Safe Act. That bill would ban seclusion, prone and supine restraint. It would ban chemical and mechanical restraint. But more importantly, the thing that I really think is important about that bill, it would add funding for schools to help them move away from these kinds of approaches. This
Exactly.
should be a no-brainer of a bill. I don't know why this has taken years. It was reintroduced this time as a bipartisan bill, which is good news. But we've got some pretty dysfunctional things happening right now. So I don't know
Yeah.
that I have a lot of faith in it happening now. But do the things that you can do as an individual to make sure that your child is safe and being appropriately supported, and anything you can do to help other families as well. The more we're coming together on this, the better. I did want to share with you, just as we wrap up here, we got a whole host of thank yous from people. Thank you
Thank
so
you so much.
much. Thank you. Thank you for bringing this challenge. Thank you. So there's lots of thank yous here. I want to give you my final thank you, and we're gonna go ahead and say goodbye to everybody else. Dr. Bell, if you would stick around for a second, I just want to give you one more final special thank you behind the screen here. But thank you, everybody that joined us today. Appreciate you being here. Again, we do these hoping to make some impact. Please share them. Get yourself the book. And again, it's a difficult read. I mean, when I read it, those stories are tough, but they're important. And we've got to acknowledge the harm that's being done, and find ways to do better. So anyway, we will say goodbye here. And Dr. Bell, if you'll just hold on for me for one moment, I'll see you behind the screen. Thanks, everybody. Take care.